Yeah, and then click okay, Will.
Everyone, cell phones off.
Well, actually, the first time I met Ben, had come into the Washington Post to do an interview with Phil Gélin, who was the editor of the editorial page, and he was looking for a secretary. And so I did this interview, and we hit it off really well. And he said, "Well, I want you to meet the editor," and he took me in to meet Ben. And he was Ben Bradlee. I was dazzled, and so anyway, we met briefly, and Phil hired me and then fired me at the end of the week because he said, before I even started, because he said, "You're overqualified and you'd end up hating me and I'd end up hating you." So I never went to work for him, but he later told me that Ben had said, "You can't possibly hire her because she will break up your marriage." So several years later, I was a theater major in college, and so I had decided I wanted to go back into acting, and I'd gone to try out for a play called We Bombed in New Haven at this local West End theater group. One day I got a call from the director after I had tried out for the part and said, "Congratulations, you've got the lead in this play." And about 5 minutes later, the phone rang, and this voice said, "Sally, you don't know me, you may not remember me. I'm Ben Bradlee, the editor of the Washington Post, and I'm interested in hiring you to cover parties for the Washington Post. Would you be interested?" So I said yes, and I went down to the Post the next day, and I had this interview with Ben, and we had this fabulous interview, and at the end of it, he said, "Can you show me something you've written?" And I said, "Well, I've never written anything." And he said, "Well, nobody's perfect. You're hired." So I went back and I called the director of the play and I said, "I'm really sorry, but I can't do this part because I've accepted a job at the Washington Post." You talk about the road not taken. I mean, my whole life diverged at that moment into another path. And so I went to work the next day and had my first byline the following day. I was totally dazzled by Ben, but he was married and had 6 children. He was the editor of the Washington Post. He was this godlike creature. In fact, I called him Mr. Bradlee. For the first 4 years that I worked there. And he used to say, "Call me Ben," but I just couldn't. He was Mr. Bradlee. And then I had decided I was in love with him. And we went to Florida to cover the convention in Miami, Richard Nixon convention. So the Washington Post travel people had assigned Ben and me to this seats next to each other on the flight. So there I was, seated next to Mr. Bradlee, and it was a very turbulent flight. So I found myself grabbing him a lot during the flight. And when we got off the flight, he said, "I'm having dinner with my friends David Brinkley and Susan Brinkley tonight. Would you like to join us?" It turned out I had actually dated David Brinkley, and Susan was one of my close friends. So I said, "Yes, I'd love to." And so I went to my hotel, and the phone rang, and he said, "Look, I'm really sorry, but Howard Simons, who's the managing editor, has arranged for the two of us to take a bunch of reporters out for dinner. And so I can't do the Brinkley dinner, but would you like to join us?" So I said, well, yes. I was really disappointed, but I said yes. And I went to the dinner, and in fact, Richard Cohen was at that dinner. And I was seated about halfway down the table from Ben, but just sort of looking at him now in a sort of very different way because he had asked me to have dinner with him. And so suddenly I was thinking, oh. Anyway, that was the end of the dinner. And about 2 nights later, I was coming out of the convention after covering it that evening. And I was standing on the sidewalk hailing a cab, and I heard this voice say, "Taxi," and I turned around, and it was Ben. And he said, "Oh, hi." He said, "Look, why don't you come to the Fontainebleau Hotel with me and have a drink?" So I said, great, I'd love to. So we got in the cab and we got out, and there were all of these Washington Post people, including Phil Jeanlin, and they said, hey, Benji, Sal, we're all going into the Flamingo Lounge. Come and have a drink with us. And we both looked at each other and we said, no thanks. And so that was the end of it. And so that whole year, and of course this is right in the middle of Watergate, that whole year I was just pining away for him. And I started writing him these little secret notes, secret admirer notes, and we would have some encounter in the newsroom, and I would then write him a little secret admirer note and put it in his mailbox. And I thought he would surely know who they were from, but he was really thick. I mean, men are so stupid sometimes. He didn't get it. In the spring, I guess May, CBS News was looking for an anchor woman for the morning news, and I would have been, or whoever was chosen would have been, the first network anchor woman in America. And Gordon Manning, who was head of CBS News, was a great friend of Ben's, and Gordon called me and asked me if I would come up for an interview. Hughes Rudd was the anchor, and he was a great, good old boy, Texan, fabulous writer who had gone to TV and was real iconoclast. And so they had interviewed all of the women at CBS, who were the ones who had started protesting in the first place that there was no real anchor, and Hughes had rejected all of them. And so I went up to New York and I had lunch with Hughes and Gordon Manning. And at the end of the lunch, Hughes said, I want her. And so Gordon looks at Hughes and he says, why Sally? Of all the people that you've interviewed, why Sally? And he says, because she's meaner than a junkyard dog. So I then came back to Washington and I told Ben that I was leaving. And I went into his office and I burst into tears. I was just sobbing because I had decided to take the job because I was too much in love with him. And it just was too painful to be around him every day and know that I couldn't be with him. I had a boyfriend in New York, and I thought, well, I'll move up to New York and I'll get away from Ben, and we can both get on with our lives. But I didn't want to leave the Post. I loved my job, and I didn't want to go to New York. I didn't want to do the TV job. But it was also kind of an offer I couldn't refuse. So I went up to New York and signed all the papers and quit the Post, and I came back. And there was a farewell party for me, and I asked Ben if he would take me for a farewell lunch. And so he said yes, and so we went to the Madison Hotel. We both ordered chicken salad. I remember these mounds of chicken salad, and I couldn't swallow, much less eat a bite. And I said, I had rehearsed this in my mind 1,000 times. I said, okay, I have to tell you why really I'm taking this job, because he had tried to talk me out of it. He'd offered me all kinds of money. Please stay, you can't go. I said, I'm taking the job because I'm in love with you, and I have to get away from you because it's just too painful and too hard to be around you. And he said, I can't believe you're telling me this because I'm in love with you too, and I have been for a whole year. And that was it. He never tried to be seductive, He just was sexy. He never tried to be sexy. It just was who he was. And so he had that sort of sensuality that pulled people in, and certainly pulled me in. He was funny. He had a great sense of humor. He was very witty, but he wasn't a comedian in any sense. But he loved to laugh. He had joie de vivre like I've never seen. He was just, I think the highest compliment he ever paid me was to say that I was a joyous creature. But he was so full of joy and so full of optimism and so full of enthusiasm that it was just irresistible. You just wanted to be around somebody. And he also had this way of talking to people, I mean, he could fire somebody and they would think that he was their best friend. I have to tell you that we were together for 43 years, and I never saw him depressed once, not in 43 years. Now, during Watergate, we would go out to West Virginia. He had this log cabin in West Virginia. It was on this wild river, and it was in the woods, with 200 acres of woods. And he would get his chainsaw and his axe and all of his toys, and he'd go out in the woods at 9 o'clock in the morning, and he wouldn't come back till 5 in the afternoon. He'd take some water with him and maybe a snack. And he would just go out and clear brush and chop down trees and, cut wood. And he always said to me that that was the most valuable time he spent. He called it mind emptying. I think today you might call it meditation. In terms of him ever worrying about being Ben, having to be Ben, he just never did. I mean, he was never afraid. He was worried about, during Watergate, he was worried about what would happen to the Washington Post if anything went down. And he was worried about Kay and the Post, and he was worried about journalism and what it would do to journalism if it turned out the Post was wrong or that things didn't go well. And he was also worried about the country. I mean, he really cared about journalism and really cared about the country. And the First Amendment was really his religion in a way. And it was something that he talked about. But, Ben didn't get into serious conversations about issues. That was not his thing. I mean, he would toss off a line or an idea, and it would be just the right thing to say, but he was not ponderous. And he couldn't stand sort of people who were pedantic, and he couldn't stand people who took themselves too seriously. He couldn't stand sanctimony. He never wanted to write a column. Just had no interest in doing that at all. And he basically wanted to get the facts out and tell the truth. And that was his goal. And sometimes it wasn't convenient. And sometimes it was dangerous. But I never saw him flinch. And sometimes I was scared to death for him and for the paper. He was never afraid for himself during Watergate. I mean, he never once said, I'm going to be in trouble. It was always about what was going to happen with the paper or with journalism or how it would affect the country, and particularly how it would affect the country if they didn't really nail the story. So it was not personal for him. And I think that whatever stress he felt during that time was not personal stress as much as it was the responsibility that he felt that he was taking on. The polio suddenly hit St. Mark's School, and a number of the kids got polio, and Ben was one of them. He had to be rushed home and rushed to the hospital. One of his friends died, and a couple of them were left paralyzed. And he was paralyzed from the waist down for about 6 months. And the thing that he got most out of that period was his relationship with his father, because his father really nursed him. His mother couldn't carry him around, He was too heavy, and so his father would carry him to the bathroom and get him out of bed and do all these things with him. And he was very, very close to his father. He adored his father. His mother, I have a feeling, was a sort of slightly a cold fish. Very proper, very New York, upper class proper. But he also read a lot, and he had not done much reading before, so he spent a lot of time reading, and that was important to him. He read a lot of history and philosophy, and he ended up majoring in ancient Greek at Harvard. And he probably never would have done that had he not had polio, but he just sort of went off on a much more intellectual tangent during that time when he wasn't able to do sports. He recovered, but was never able to really run. He couldn't play singles in tennis, for instance, and he couldn't run, and even he didn't like walking. I mean, when we went to the beach every summer, we'd go up to Long Island, and I loved nothing more than walk on the beach, and Ben just couldn't do it. It was just too hard for him to take long walks. And so his main activity was working out in the woods, and there's a lot of aerobics involved in that because you're really pulling things down and chopping things, but the polio, I think of the three most sort of seminal moments in his, well, four I'd have to say: polio, and then the war, and Watergate, and Quinn's illness and heart surgery and near death were the four things that affected him the most in his life, and were real turning points for him in many different ways. Ben was always positive about everything. That's why I said when I would get upset at something and he'd say, well, and it did drive me crazy sometimes, I mean, I'm not a pessimist, but sometimes things go badly, and he just wouldn't accept that things were going to go badly. And he was always positive about everything. He never believed he was going to be paralyzed, and he wasn't. And, one of the problems that we had when Quinn was sick is that he just simply wouldn't believe that Quinn was not going to be okay. And I was always scared Quinn was going to die, or that, he would be sick for the rest of his life or whatever. And honestly, I think you've met Quinn, so you know what a wonderful spirit he is. He's a magical person. And I really think that he's that way because of Ben. I told Quinn something the other day about something I was worried about. And he just said, Mom, why are you going to worry about that now? It hasn't happened, If something happens, then we'll worry about it later. And I thought, boy, is that his father speaking. And Quinn has exactly the same attitude about life that Ben does, which is always looking at the positive side, always seeing things, the glass is always half full, always. And actually for Ben and for Quinn, the glass is always full, not just half full. And that was just hugely important to me, to have somebody like that in my life who was always strong. I mean, because I would be fearful sometimes, and I would get scared, and I would be sad, and I'd be upset. And Ben was like when somebody says that person is my rock, Ben was the rock. I think he would love this, and I think he would love it because it was Quinn's idea. And that I think he would love the fact that Quinn would be involved in it, and Quinn is so on fire about it. And Quinn adored his father. I mean, I've never seen a father and son have a relationship the way the two of them did. I mean, Ben really thought of Quinn as his best friend, and Quinn grew up with a lot of problems, and he had learning disabilities when he was younger, and he didn't have a lot of friends, and so they spent a lot of time together, particularly out in the woods. And Ben would always say to Quinn, I admire you more than anybody I know in my life. That's pretty heady stuff for somebody to have Ben Bradlee say that about you. And so Quinn has a lot of confidence in himself. In fact, as he pointed out the other day, he said, maybe I have too much confidence in myself. But Ben just sort of gave him that confidence because he loved him so much and he was so close to him. And And I don't think Quinn would be nearly the person he is today if he hadn't had that infusion of love and affection and admiration from Ben. And, you know, I was a pretty good mother, but I couldn't have given Quinn what Ben did. Ben was very adventurous, you know. He wanted to get out of there. And, you know, he accelerated at Harvard. He went through Harvard in 3 years so that he could go to war, and he asked to be on a destroyer, which was probably the most dangerous assignment you could have because people on destroyers were getting killed left and right. But he was just desperate to get to war. He couldn't wait to go to war. And to get out of Harvard. I mean, you know, it's a very provincial atmosphere, Boston, particularly in those days. And everybody knew everybody else, and they were all related to each other, and they all went to the same clubs, and they all went to the same beach, and they all went to, you know, it was very incestuous. And Ben just wanted to see the world, and he loved being in the Navy, and he loved being at war. You know, people always talk about, well, so-and-so was at war, and they never talk about it because it was so awful. And Ben didn't talk about the grimness of the war, but he did talk about the exhilaration of being, you know, in combat and in a situation where you were in danger. He was not a daredevil by any means, but he felt that gave his life meaning more than almost anything he ever did. That was the most meaningful time in his life, that he was doing something really important, and he was. I don't think he's ever had a moment of guilt in his life, honestly. He had a few affairs when he was married to Jean, and he wasn't guilty about that. And he had a few affairs when he was married to Tony, and he wasn't guilty about that. He did, but Paris was a huge deal for him. I mean, he was there for 7 years. He was in his element. He spoke fluent French. He loved the French. He loved France. He loved everything about it, you know. And he you know, it brought out all of his sensuality that he had not been brought out in Boston. I don't ever think of Boston as the most sensual place in the world. You know, Paris is. And he, you know, started eating well. He loved food. He loved wine. You know, he went to great restaurants. He traveled all over Europe. He went skiing. He had affairs. He had a fabulous time. The idea of working at the Washington Post is that he was interested in politics, particularly after the war. So the idea of being in Washington where politics is covered, even though the Washington Post was like the number 3 newspaper at the time, that intrigued him. And I think he saw an opportunity there. You know, I would guess that one of the reasons that Ben didn't go to the New York Times is because the New York Times was already the New York Times. And I think Ben always liked the idea of making a difference and changing things and creating things. And I think that, I mean, it's like going to work for the biggest law firm or going to work for the biggest investment bank. It's already there. It's already done. And you can work your way up to the top, but somebody else already created that. And I think the idea of coming to work for a paper that was not the number 1 was a huge challenge, just like going to war was a challenge. It gave him something to work for. He was very romantic. Ben cried a lot, actually. Cried more than I did. He would cry in movies and cry in commercials. I mean, as soon as the violin would start, Ben would start. But here's the thing about Ben. Ben never cried in real life. He only cried in fictional things. He would cry in movies, he would cry in commercials, he would cry, but I never saw him cry over Quinn. And that was the saddest and, the most difficult time he's ever been through. I never cry in commercials and I never cry in movies, but I cry in real life. And I think that was the difference. And I in some way, I think that, he was romantic in the sense that it was a sort of, he was intellectually romantic. He had this vision of things that were romantic, things that moved him, and it was kind of almost automatic that he would get teared up about ideas and stories. He just never, he didn't have any idea. He had no idea of how he looked and how he came across, and he didn't think about it. As I said, he was more comfortable in his own skin than anybody I've ever met. He'd write and he was always joking about, his trench coat with the bullet holes in it and all that kind of thing. And he loved the romance of journalism. That was for him the most romantic thing. And the romance of war. Ben was not terribly introspective. He didn't wallow in things, he didn't, oh my God, what have I done? Am I doing the right thing? Who am I? What am I here for? That was not Ben. He was just not introspective. And, I was a lot more introspective than he was. And, but that, I think part of that was what was appealing in a way, is that he never agonized over anything. He was, he was always, he didn't second guess himself. And I think part of that was part of his appeal was that he wasn't introspective, that he was just out there in the world, and he was just living his life. And he wasn't thinking about it every day. He wasn't pondering it every day. He used to call it navel gazing. He hated navel gazing. I think they saw the best in each other. They were very much alike in a lot of ways. They were both sort of dashing and sexy and charming and good-looking and smart and funny. And, Jack had a very good sense of humor, and so did Ben. And also, they both loved to gossip. And Jack wanted to know what was going on all the time, and Ben, of course, as a journalist, knew everything that was going on. And so they would have dinner like 3 times a week at the White House, and Ben would walk in, and Jack would say, what do you know? What do you know? What's going on? Tell me all the gossip. Because, of course, he was living in this bubble. And nobody ever told him anything. And of course, nobody around the White House really knew what was going on. So he was just fascinated. And they would sit there and then they would talk about the issues and all of that. But both of them understood that it was more important, it was equally important to know about the people and the personalities behind who was making the policy and who was making the decisions and who was behaving in a certain way. And that's what Jack and Ben really talked about a lot, because Ben was really interested in personalities. I think he remembered going to the White House and a group of them being ushered into the Oval Office and just sort of sitting around and hanging out with the president. There was nothing formal about it. It was just kind of people wandering in and out of the press office, and there weren't that many reporters. There was no real press corps. And so now you have a formality that, it's impenetrable almost, and gets worse every administration. So, it was a very different time. And the other thing is that today, if Jack Kennedy's antics, romantic antics, had been known about, they'd be all over the internet in 20 minutes. That would never have been able to exist. But then also, you remember the press didn't report when Roosevelt had polio when he was in a wheelchair. No one ever took pictures of him in a wheelchair or even showed him on crutches. It was just kind of understood that you didn't do that. And that would never, no, there's no way. I mean, it's the dark ages if you think about it. I say that if he had known, I would have gotten out of him. You know? He would have told me eventually, you know. I mean, he just didn't know. He really didn't know. And I mean, he said, I know it makes me look stupid, but the fact is that nobody, I guess people knew that I was his closest friend and that nobody was going to come up to me and say, guess what? And he just didn't know. I mean, he had no reason not to say so. There was no reason for him to pretend that he didn't know. And also, I was with him when the stories started coming out, and he was in shock. You know, he was so disappointed and then ultimately revolted. And I saw his reaction as he was learning these things. He did not want to be in the inner circle, and he felt that being in the inner circle would have him be compromised. And one of the things about the Kennedys, and whether they wanted it or not, was that they had a lot of hangers-on and a lot of sycophants and a lot of lords and ladies in waiting. And Ben did not want to play that role, and he would not play that role. And so he was happy to be Jack's friend, but he saw himself as Jack's equal. And if ever he felt that he was being compromised on any level, whether it was personal or political, or he would back away because he didn't want to be part of that. He did not want to be part of the entourage, and he never was. I mean, and, you know, it's hard to know when to draw the line, but he always knew when to draw the line. When you could, where was the moment when you said, I don't think so. I don't want to play here. Well, I think that Kay was very glamorized by Ben. I mean, she was very glamorized by Ben and Tony and the Jack and Jackie. You know, those. I felt like an ugly duckling when I was around all those beautiful young women, and so I think she was glamorized by Ben. And so they had this famous lunch, and she asked him if he'd like to come to the Post, and that's when he said, "I'd give my left one." And I mean, I think Kay always had a little crush on Ben, but you know, there was never anything sexual between them at all. And I think Ben absolutely adored Kay. I don't think it, I know it. He just loved her. And you know, she was insecure in a lot of ways. And as I said about myself, Ben made me feel safe. He made me feel protected and secure. And I think he made Kay feel that way. He gave her an enormous amount of confidence because he had so much confidence in himself, and so he gave Kay confidence. And so they had this great relationship. And also Kay loved gossip too. And she loved journalism, and she loved the newsroom, and you know, but she was off in this ivory tower, and everybody always sort of, oh, Mrs. Graham, and you know, she had that accent, you know, which is sort of really off-putting, and so people were, they were a little afraid of her, and Ben was not, you know, and she would complain about something in the paper, and Ben would say, "Get your finger out of my eye." And so he treated her like she was a normal person, which she was, and she loved that. As you know, they would tease each other. I mean, they weren't he wasn't vicious with Kay the way he was with his men's friend, but they had a very teasing relationship, and she would come down every day and go sit in his office and close the door and schmooze. You know, she just wanted to know, okay, it was like Jack Kennedy, what's going on, what's happening in the newsroom, what's the story? And she always wanted to know what was going on, and they had this thing they called the no surprises rule, which was that she didn't ever want to have to pick up the paper and learn something or have somebody come up to her at a dinner party. First of all, Ben started style. He invented style. And he invented it about 2 or 3 months before he hired me. The thing that was interesting about style is that it completely revolutionized journalism. And most people think of Ben in terms of Watergate, in terms of his accomplishment. But I think that in terms of what he did for journalism and how he changed journalism, that maybe inventing style was as important, if not more important, than Watergate. I don't mean to diminish Watergate, but that was one story, and it was a great story. But I think that it was interesting because Ben was a feminist in a way that what I meant was that for Ben, everybody was equal. He just didn't discriminate against anybody. But he also wanted people, he recognized people for their talent and not who or what they were, what color, what gender, whatever. He liked talent. So I guess he was discriminating in the sense that he liked talented people, and he hired talent, and he recognized talent. And I think that he thought that the style section was called For and About Women. And it was really about, going to teas and parties and, ladies' events, and everybody wore pearls and white gloves, and it was boring. It was really boring. So there was this whole section, and it was sexist in a way. I mean, you would never have had a section called For and About Men. And Ben wanted the section to be, he wanted something that would be alive and that would be covering the sociology of the day, of the moment, and what was going on in the country and what was going on in the sex, what was going on. And this was 60s. So there was a lot going on that we weren't covering because there was sort of no place to put it. It didn't really belong. We didn't have a feature section. So a lot of that stuff just didn't go into For and About Women because it wasn't about teas and luncheons. And he wanted a different kind of party coverage. He didn't quite know what kind of a party coverage he wanted, but he just wanted it to be different. So he put in the best writers in the section. So he took people from National and Metro and sports and brought them into style, so that because they were all women, they were all ladies. They all had teacups on their desks, I'm not kidding, and they all wore white gloves. Well, when I went in to interview Ben, I wore white gloves. I had my little purse and my little white gloves and my pearls. So I think he wanted to reflect society, and he just felt that For and About Women was not reflective. This is in '69, so it was really after the '68 riots and, the anti-Vietnam War and all that. He just felt like we weren't covering the story. And that was the reason he started Style. What are you working on? What's breaking? I'm going to a party. Henry Kissinger's going to be there. Is there anything you need to know? And so then I would go out and I would go to the party and I would see Henry Kissinger. And of course, I had my little notebook, but I also had a drink in my hand, and everybody else had drinks in their hands. And I would say, what's going on with China? And, and people would just talk more openly, and you could get to talk to them in a way you couldn't if you would try to make a date for an interview in their office. They would never talk to you. But they would schmooze casually over cocktails. And so I found that we were breaking stories, not just me, but the other party reporters. Once once we got the nod that we could write what we wanted to write, then we started covering party stories the way you would cover any other stories. Yes, he was very tough. I mean, when I first came to work there, and a lot of people were scared of him, and they thought that he was, because he was tough, and he was a taskmaster. He was a taskmaster, and he worked really hard. I mean, he worked 12 hours, 14 hours, 18 hours a day sometimes, and he'd work on weekends. And he expected the same thing of other people. I mean, this was not a 9-to-5 business from his point of view. And he really expected people to be on top of the story and on their beats. And he didn't like laziness, and he didn't like sloppiness. And he wanted to get the story. Ben was very competitive, very, very competitive about everything. And so, you know, people who didn't do the work were not in his favor. And, you know, people wanted to be one of Ben's favorites. And so there were people who were thought of as Ben's favorites and not. And Ben was sort of, I mean, I remember people telling me that Ben would run over his grandmother to get a story. And that's probably only half true. I have to say that I think that I softened him up a little bit when he and I got together. I mean, obviously, he used his brain, but in the end, his gut would just tell him, I don't think so. This is not right. And he would hold off. And he said that his predecessor, Russ Wiggins, had always said, you know, when you want to write a tough letter, write a letter and then put it in your drawer and come back the next day and read it and see if you really want to send it. And he really did do that. I mean, because sometimes he'd get so pissed off at somebody that he'd dash off a letter. I mean, I think that one letter he wrote to this guy who was he wrote a letter to this guy who was a newspaper critic who ran this right-wing operation criticizing the liberal press. And Ben wrote a letter, which he actually did send, which he called him a retro-mengent asshole. And nobody knew what retro-mengent was. Ben was really thrilled with himself over this. Retro-mengent means somebody who pees on himself. You know, it's interesting because Ben always talked about how well he learned how to talk that way in the Navy, which he did. And then, of course, in journalism, people are pretty profane, too. I think now everybody is in the world, but in those days, it went from the military, from World War II. People were profane, and he brought that into the world of journalism. And when I first started going out with journalists and then went to work for the Post, I remember having never heard people use language like that before. But somehow, the way Ben always chose exactly the right word to use at the exact moment, and it never seemed to be a dirty word, you know? It always seemed to be just the precisely right word at the right moment that you wanted to use. It would make people laugh. He always made people laugh with his, and sometimes he liked it when I was being outrageous. Sometimes I can be outrageous. And I would be at a dinner party and I'd be telling some outrageous story, and then Ben would say, "Jesus Christ, Sally," you know, and he would start on this thing about me, and everybody would burst out laughing. It was and he would pretend to be outraged and, you know, horrified and everything else, but he really enjoyed that. But with Quinn, with both of us, but particularly with Ben, we were using this language around Quinn, and Ben was too, and we was about 4. Quinn had learned all these bad words, and this couple came to visit from out of town, very straight-laced. I don't know why they were there. I can't remember who they were, but from the Midwest. And so Quinn came downstairs in his little pajamas, his onesies, to say goodnight, and he was, I guess, 4 or 5. And so, and he had some dollar bills in his hand. And so, you know, this couple said, "Oh, Quinn, how are you?" And he said, "Fine." He said, "Aren't you a big boy? Look at you." And he said, "And look at all that money. Where did you get all that money?" And Quinn said, "Well, I get paid every time my parents say a dirty word." And he said, "I have a lot of money." And they said, "Well, how much do you get paid?" And Quinn said, "Well, motherfucker is $2. So anyway, that was Ben's legacy. And the whole idea that the Pentagon Papers was a matter of national security, which was the argument. As Ben always said, when they say it's a matter of national security, what they really mean is it's a matter of national embarrassment. And that was what the issue was. So, but I mean, that was the precursor to Watergate, but that just really got its juices flowing, you know, and because there was really a threat to the First Amendment. And it was a serious threat to the First Amendment. And Ben felt that if they didn't make a stand then, that they would start, their freedoms would start being eroded. It was absolutely who he was. And I think that, you know, when he was in the war, he said to me later, you know, because he had started out when he was in high school doing journalism, but when he was in the war, he kept saying, "What were we fighting for? We were fighting for our freedoms. And one of the most important freedoms we have is freedom of speech. And if we don't have that, then we're not free." I think that it was really important that Ben had given Kay an enormous amount of confidence in herself because he believed in her. He knew how smart she was. And he knew that she had an enormous amount of integrity and values and ethics and morals and all the things that were important to him. And so he made her believe in herself, so that he made her strong. As I said, he's made me feel strong and safe and protected. He made Kay feel strong and safe and protected. And if Ben said it was okay and it was going to work, then she believed it. And then that gave her the strength to make the right decisions. It happened very quickly. You know, it was not this long, drawn-out thing. It was that the New York Times came out with the story, and then suddenly the Post had to get on it and get on top of it, and so it wasn't like Watergate that went on for years. And so I don't have a strong, and of course I wasn't with Ben then, and I wasn't involved in any way. And with Watergate, it was such a slow, and of course with Watergate, Bob and Carl were friends of mine, and also I was writing stories about some of the personalities who were involved in Watergate. So I was much more involved. And so I don't remember much about the Pentagon Papers. I just remember that everyone in the paper was really very excited about the fact that we had stood up to the government and that we had won. And that there was a sense that what we were doing was really important. Absolutely, it did lay the groundwork. I mean, I think that once you saw that the First Amendment, once you saw that the First Amendment could be threatened that way and could be put in jeopardy, that there was no question that you would do everything you could to fight that the second time around. people in journalism all over the country wanted to come and work for Ben. And I mean, I still have people coming up to me today, journalists, really high-powered journalists, who will say, my greatest regret is that I never got to work for Ben Bradlee. I mean, he owned the newsroom, but in a good way, you know. I mean, he wasn't power mad or anything. It's just that he walked through the room and it was electric. I mean, because he would go and he'd come by people's desks and he'd say, great story. He called everybody chief. I mean, the guys anyway. He'd slap them on the back. Hey, great story, chief, you know. And everybody, oh my God, Ben Bradlee thought my story was great. And he wouldn't say it unless he meant it too. And everybody knew that. And but he prowled the newsroom. You know, what's going on? What's the story here? What do you think? What do you think? You know, what do you got? What do you got? And he engaged with people all the time, and he was so excited about the stories. And I never sat in on one of his story conferences, but you know, they were legendary. You know, that Ben would sit in the story conference with his feet on the desk, and he'd let people talk, and then he would sort of pipe up with, you know, that's bullshit, you know, or whatever he would say, you know, or go get him or whatever. But it was, you know, people wanted to please him, and they wanted to do a good job for him. And it was just fun. I can't keep saying that word enough. It was just fun. It was so much fun to be a journalist. It was so exciting. And every day you'd come in and you didn't know what the story was, and he didn't know what the story was, what it was going to be. And every day it was, let's go out and get those stories and let's do it. And just every day was a new day, and every day there was something to look forward to. And you wanted, you know, I guess the word I would have to use is inspiring. You know, and when he would tell me, I knew, you know, when I'd write a story, I knew that Ben would like it. You know, I would just be so, because I was writing for Ben. And I think that's the thing, is that everybody in the paper was writing for Ben. They were writing for his approval. I think within the first few weeks, people began to think there was something there. You know, just rumbling around the newsroom. You know, this looks like more than what it seems like. I mean, at first it was just a lowly break-in story, which is, of course, why Bob and Carl were assigned to it. They were Metro reporters, and they were young, and you know, you wouldn't call in the A-team on a lowly break-in story. But it then started to look like something. Yeah, you could feel it building after about the first few weeks. You could feel that there was something going on there that might be bigger than what it appeared to be. And I mean, I can't really pinpoint when it was that it became clear. But I think, you know, I remember hearing around the newsroom that some of the national reporters and the national editor wanted to take it away from Bob and Carl and Metro, because they just thought it was getting to be a big story. And that then there was an argument about, you know, and Ben said, look, these kids got the story, you know, let them stay. They're doing a good job. He thought it was a great story. He thought, right, and you know, from the beginning, when the Nationals started saying, I think this is time for the big boys to take over. I thought that's when Ben really got excited. But he just felt there was something there. I mean, when they got the little address book with all the numbers in the White House, that's when Ben got really excited and said, this is big. At some point, he and Bob went out to Lafayette Square and sat on a bench, and Ben said, you got to tell me who it is. And that's when Bob told me. But I never knew, and I never asked. No one can believe I never asked. But I knew he wouldn't tell me, and I didn't think he should. And I didn't want to know anyway, because then I was afraid I might tell somebody. You know? Well, at some point, you know, they're putting the whole newspaper on the line. I think there's a line in All the President's Men where he said, we're talking about the First Amendment, the future of the country, the Constitution, the whatever, only our lives. That's all we're talking about here. So, yeah, I mean, it was important to know who it was. Well, but the thing was, Deep Throat was right. You know, you got a good source. He was right. He was sending Bob off in the right direction every time. And every story just kept adding more and more veracity to what they already knew. Well, we all suspected they might be. I mean, we all acted as though they were, and certainly we acted as though our home phones were tapped. And, there was one story where somebody tried to sell Carl marijuana on the street, and we just assumed that was a setup, that somebody was trying to nail him. And so Ben was constantly trying to, making sure everybody was just not paranoid, but just because it became to be clear that these guys were not messing around. And so we had to be extra careful with everything, which is why I never, during that year, from the convention until the following summer, early spring, that's why I quit the Post, because I knew that if I told him I loved him, I could tell that he really cared about me, that I knew that we'd probably end up having an affair. And I was afraid that if we did, he would get caught, either be blackmailed. He wouldn't have allowed himself to be blackmailed, but then that would have been a big scandal, and it would have totally destroyed the whole relationship, the whole story for the Post. It would have been such a distraction, and it would have given the Nixon people fodder for, they would have given them ammunition against him. And so I just felt I couldn't do it. That's why I quit and went to work for CBS. And he didn't think that he was an honorable person. I think he didn't believe him, he didn't trust him. Yeah, he was a liar. Obviously. When he stood up there and said, "I am not a crook," Ben said, "Oh, yeah." He didn't, yes, he was not an honorable person. He was not an honest person. But I have to say that after Nixon resigned, when David Frost did his Nixon interviews, Ben and I were sitting here in the library watching the David Frost interviews, and about halfway through the interviews, and Nixon was going like this, and Ben sort of said, "Oh, God, oh, God, oh, God, no." And I said, "What's the matter, Ben?" He said, "Oh, I miss him so much. I miss him so much." So, there was this thing he had about Nixon that, he was a great story. He really elevated the press. Well, Nixon was a totally Shakespearean character. He was just such a flawed person because he was bright. And if it hadn't been for Watergate, he would not have been a bad president. He was perfectly good on foreign policy. But he just was lacking morals and ethics and values. And it's really sad. Oh, yeah, Ben was ecstatic. And I remember him talking to, we were having dinner right after we heard about the tapes with Edward Bennett Williams, and Ben was saying, "Oh my God, this is so fabulous, we got these tapes." And Ed said, "I want to be Nixon's defense lawyer," because Ed was a defense lawyer, criminals were his thing. And he said, "Oh my God, I would kill to be his defense lawyer." And Ben said, "What's the first thing you'd do?" And he said, "I would take all of those fucking tapes and I'd put them on the White House lawn and I'd set them on fire and have a bonfire and burn them." Ben said, "Well, I'm glad you're not going to be his defense lawyer." No, Ben was, there it was. There was the whole story. And it was vindicated, the Post, and. He talked about that in the movie, when he was talking to Bob and Carl. He'd say, only the Constitution and the First Amendment's at stake. Yes, and they did make some mistakes. They weren't wrong sometimes, and it just killed him. He couldn't stand to be wrong. But, they were right most of the time, and they got the story right. I mean, nothing's worse if you're a journalist than to print something that's wrong. Nothing is worse. I mean, it would not seem so in the atmosphere we live in today. But if you're a real journalist and what you care about is the truth, then to get something wrong is just the worst nightmare you could possibly have. He was a little embarrassed by it. He'd much prefer to sort of walk down the street and not have people know who he was. And, I had my little 15 minutes of fame when I was on CBS Morning News, and my picture was on the cover of magazines, and I was on TV, and it was a big story. And then Ben and I got together, and then that was a bigger story, and Ben had been in the middle of Watergate, and so we were a story, and it was uncomfortable. Neither one of us really liked being famous. And I remember when I wrote my book about CBS, and I was talking about Ben too, I said, I've discovered that the perfect kind of fame is to have everybody know your name and nobody know your face. And and only if they admire you for who you are. So I think, after his book came out and after Watergate, people knew who he was, and sometimes they'd know who I was. If we were together, they would generally know who we were, and we would, walk into it. I mean, we'd sometimes be, in some foreign country, and somebody would come up to us, and I always felt a little violated. Or we'd walk down the street, or you'd walk in a restaurant, and you're not thinking, because we were never that famous, you're not thinking that you're famous. And so if somebody comes up and says, oh, it was always with Ben, oh, it's such an honor to meet you, and I admire thank you for what you've done for our country, or whatever. And Ben it would always make him uncomfortable, and he didn't really like it very much. He didn't need the adulation. He just didn't need it. It makes you a little uncomfortable because you're on the other side of the pen and pencil, or whatever you'd call it today, but you're on the other side. And so suddenly when you're thrust, I mean, I always said, and so did Ben, after both of us got a certain amount of notoriety, that every journalist should have the experience of being written about before they're allowed to practice journalism, because you've got to know what it feels like to be on the other side, because it'll make you a lot more careful about what you do. And I feel that's really true, because it was an eye opener to me. I mean, I love journalists and I trust journalists, and I believe devoutly in the First Amendment and freedom of speech and journalism. But there's some journalists who are not very good, and some journalists who are not honest, and some journalists who do get things wrong, just like they're bad doctors and bad lawyers and bad car repairmen. I mean, they're good ones and they're bad ones. And so if you get burned by somebody, it's a real shock, and it's a real eye-opener, because you don't expect that from your colleagues. And so I think that for Ben was revealing, and for me too. But I mean, there's some people who love fame and love being famous, and I'm always amused at people who are really, really famous, and they walk down the street and they go out in public and they show off, and then they complain about the publicity. And you want to say, wait a minute, because we became public figures, so that we didn't really have a right to complain about anything. I mean, there were some things that were so over the top written about us that were, really horrifying. But in general, you put yourself out there. I found an ashtray once that I bought for Ben and for us and it said, "Don't play the game if you can't take the pain." And I think that's true about fame, and it's a double-edged sword. But I think Ben and I were both of us much more comfortable being not recognized than recognized. I sort of didn't really know her. I was vaguely aware. And she actually was a roommate of Elsa Walsh, who was Woodward's girlfriend. And that was before Bob and Elsa got together, I think. And then she wrote this extraordinary story about Jimmy, this little boy who was on drugs. And it just took the newsroom by storm. I mean, it took the city by storm. And Woodward was the editor of Metro at the time, but she had an immediate editor, and then there was another editor the story went through, and then Woodward, and then the managing editor, and then Ben. And it was a fabulous story, and it was beautifully written. And when the story broke, Marion Barry gave a press conference and said, "We know who Jimmy is. We've identified him. We're taking care of him. We're dealing with the family. It's all, And then she was nominated for the Pulitzer Prize. And I remember being up in Boston when they announced that she'd won the Pulitzer Prize. And it would have been about a month before that I started hearing rumblings in the newsroom that maybe the story wasn't true. And I didn't say anything to Ben about it. For some reason, I didn't mention it. But there was this, and I thought maybe it was jealousy or grousing or something like that. But it just got heated up, and people were really questioning the story. And I was in Boston, and I was with some reporters, and the story broke that she'd won the Pulitzer, and I said, "Oh no, oh my God." I mean, I just remember had this awful feeling in my stomach. And they said, "What's the matter?" And I said, "I think she made this story up." And this one person turned to me and said, "That's just sour grapes." I said, "I just have this awful feeling." And then, of course, I think that they started looking at her bio, and that she said she'd graduated from Vassar, and she never did, and then she spoke French, and Ben went up to her and called her in and started speaking French to her, and of course she didn't speak a word, and they just got her, locked her in a room and just grilled her, and she fell apart and said she'd made the story up, and so we had to give the Pulitzer back. And we had this wonderful ombudsman named Bill Green, and Ben put Bill on the story, and he said, "I want you to write this story from beginning to end. Do not spare anybody, even me, but I want the story, the way it happened and how this whole thing happened." And Bill did this brilliant story, just talking to her editors, talking to her, talking to people that she talked to. And as it happened, that week or so, there was the newspaper editors conference, the ASNE, and Ben's friend, the editor of the Globe, Tom Winship, had asked Ben to be the program chairman. And Ben hated the ASNE, and he hated the whole idea of being program chairman. He never did anything like that. Ben was not a joiner, ever, about anything. But he agreed because Tom strong-armed him, and so, anyway, suddenly the program that got scrapped, and the program became Janet Cooke. And so I went with Ben that morning. They had a panel on Janet Cooke, and they had it in this auditorium. They had to move the whole thing to an auditorium because, of course, everybody showed up because they wanted to see Ben get sacrificed. And Don Graham came in and sat next to Ben. As Ben said, Don had his arm around me the entire morning and didn't take his arm away. And I sat there, and one editor after the other got up and excoriated Ben and just said, "How could this happen? This is appalling. And as it turned out, within the next month, the two editors who had been the most critical of Ben both printed stories by their reporters that were not true and had to have them retracted. And, of course, what everyone had forgotten was that Marion Barry had gotten up the day after the story broke and said, "We know who Jimmy is." So there was no reason to question the story. But But Janet Cooke was a sick person. I mean, she made it up. She was sick, and so she had to be fired, and that was the end of that. It was much harder for me because I was so worried that he wouldn't have anything to do, or he wouldn't have enough to do. And he didn't sort of plan his retirement. And, I knew that Don had asked him to stay on till he was 75. I can't believe that he quit when he was 70. He was so young. I mean, he had a child who was 9. But he just said, look, I'm at the top of my game right now, I'm not going to do any better, and I'm getting bored. He was spending more and more time sitting at his desk doing crossword puzzles. And, after Watergate, everything is sort of a letdown. And the big stories just weren't coming. And he just couldn't get excited about sort of the daily story. He said, I've seen every story come around and around and around. I've wrestled with presidents and secretaries of state and secretaries of defense and heads of CIA and all, I've done it all. And so and he said, I don't think it's fair to the paper. I don't want to be here and not be doing my best and be at the top of my game. And so I'd rather leave when I'm on top than wait until people sort of say, oh my God, when is that guy going to get out of here, And people really didn't want him to leave, but he just felt that it was the right thing to do. And I think it was a very brave thing for him to do. But for me, it was hard because I was so worried about him. But of course, I should have known better than to be worried about Ben, because Ben was Ben. And he was never going to be diminished in any way. I remember the summer, well, he had his farewell at the Post in end of July, and then we went up to Long Island in August, and then his actual retirement date was September the 1st, I think. But essentially, and they had a big send-off for him at the paper, and everybody showed up wearing striped shirts with white collars. And it was a very emotional day, and people stood up and talked, and I actually talked. And, well, I remember when I left the Post to go to CBS News, there was what we call a caking. They have farewell cakes for everybody. There was a caking for me in style, and Ben came back. And this is after we'd had this really sort of emotional experience in his office where I cried. This is before I told him I loved him. And he came back and made this speech, which was really mean, which I knew that meant that he was being affectionate. And at the end, he said, raise his glass. Let's raise a glass to Sally, who's forgotten but not gone. And so I said that about Ben when I got up, and I said, I'm going to get him back now, because I just want to say he may be forgotten, but he's not gone, because he was going upstairs to the 9th floor. And we walked out of the newsroom, and everybody applauded, and it was very nice. Ben did not want to have another baby because he had been married twice. He had 3 other kids. He was almost 60 years old, but I was almost 40, and I had never had children, and I wanted to have a baby. And so we had, shall we say, discussions about it. And Ben just said, I'm too old to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning and feedings and all, I just can't do it again. And I said, but I've never done it. And so anyway, talk about being tough. I said to Ben, okay, well, I'm going to have a baby. So either it's going to be yours or it's going to be somebody else's. You get to choose. So that sort of focused his mind. And so he finally agreed that we would have a baby. And so I got pregnant almost immediately. And I just had the most wonderful pregnancy. I wasn't sick at all, and I just felt radiant and happy the whole time. And Ben was really excited and happy, but also his back went out, and so he had to wear a back brace. I think he was terrified at being a father again. He was at almost 61. I think he was really scared, the way one might be scared when you're 21 and you're about to be a father. You know, it was the same kind of thing, because his children were grown by then. And Quinn was born, and he was the most beautiful baby you've ever seen. But when the doctor came to examine him the next day, his pediatrician, she detected a heart murmur. And she was a little concerned, but she said it didn't sound bad, but she wanted us to go to Children's Hospital to have an exam. And so we took him to Children's Hospital, and it turned out that he had a hole in his heart, but they thought it was very small, and that was not uncommon, and that the hole would always close up, or most often close up after a couple of years. But here are the symptoms of heart failure, and just be looking out for them. And so I wasn't terribly concerned, but when Quinn was about 3 months old, or 2 months old, I guess, was my birthday. And I remember having people over for dinner, and he had been very fussy all weekend. I mean, during the week and that day, and wouldn't nurse. And I'd take him to the pediatrician. She said he was okay, but anyway, they wanted to see him, and I brought him downstairs, and I looked at him, and I thought, there's something wrong with this child. There's something wrong. I don't know what it is. But I just literally come from the doctor. And so we took him up to the country the next morning. When we drove up to the country, and he was fussy, and he wouldn't feed. And that night, he was fussy all night long. And the next morning, he was having trouble breathing, and he was crying a lot and wouldn't nurse. And I just said to Ben, there's something terribly wrong here. We've got to get him back. So we got in the car, and we had to keep stopping the car because he was crying so much. And I got home and called the cardiology department at Children's Hospital and explained the symptoms, and they said, he's in heart failure, bring him in right away. So Ben and I took him over to the hospital, and he was, in fact, in heart failure. And so we put him in they admitted him to the hospital and put him on all kinds of IVs. And they did more tests and found out that the hole in his heart was much bigger than they had thought it was. And they were actually stunned. And so they decided he needed to have heart surgery, but he was too weak by that point and too small to really operate on, so they wanted to wait as long as they could. And so I lived in the hospital with him for over a month. And this was probably one of the most traumatic times of our lives. Well, I think for Ben, probably the most traumatic time, because the same day that, I was in the hospital, and I lived there in the room. I had been in the hospital for a year when I was a child in Tokyo, and my father was in Korea, and they never found out what was wrong with me, but they wouldn't allow my parents to come visit me. My father was gone, but they wouldn't allow my mother to visit me. They had no visiting hours in the hospital. And so I was determined never to leave Quinn alone for 1 minute. And so either I was there, or my mother was in the room, or he had a babysitter come for 2 hours every night, and Ben would come and pick me up and see Quinn and take me out to dinner and then bring me back. And I would stay in the hospital. And he lost more and more weight, got sicker and sicker and sicker, and it was clear that he was going to die. I mean, I could tell that. I just knew that. And the other terrible thing that was happening is that the next day, Ben had to go to trial because he was being sued by the head of Mobil Oil, this guy named Tavel Reyes. The Washington Post had written a story that he had helped his son out in his company, and it reflected badly on him, and so he sued the Washington Post for millions of dollars. And so the trial started the day after Quinn went into the hospital. So I was in the hospital all day, and Ben was in court all day, and then he would come and see me, and then he would go home, and this went on for a month. and Quinn was getting sicker, and I was getting more frantic. And finally, they said they couldn't postpone the surgery any longer because he wasn't going to make it. And so they scheduled the surgery for a Tuesday. The doctors didn't operate on Fridays and Mondays, the heart surgeons. And I realized that Quinn was not going to make it. I just knew he was going to die. And I said, can't we do it earlier? Well, they have all these others, elective patients. And I said, I went to the surgeon and I said, he's going to die. He will not make it until Tuesday. I'm just telling you this. This is my mother's gut. And Ben was, of course, frantic because he was in the, he was in the hospital. He saw Quinn getting smaller and smaller and weaker and weaker and bluer and bluer. And I was so hysterical that the doctors finally said, okay, we'll operate on Friday. And I think because they were pediatricians, I think they'd had enough experience with mother's gut that they listened to me. And so we went into surgery, and we took Quinn down to the operating room, and because you can't eat before surgery, so Quinn couldn't nurse, and so I couldn't hold him because he kept going for my breast, and so I wasn't able to hold him because he would start screaming when he couldn't nurse. It was just horrible. Anyway, Ben and I took him down, and the doctors came and took him out of my arms and to take him into the surgery, and I just collapsed on the floor, just sobbing. I couldn't even speak. I was crying so hard. And Ben leaned down, he picked me up, he put me in his arms, and he said, just think of it this way, he'll never have to go to war. Because, of course, he would be 4F. And being an Army brat, I knew exactly what he was talking about, and that the idea of sending my son off to war was so horrible. It was the only thing he could have said that made me feel better. And so anyway, we sat and we went to the cafeteria, and at one point Art Buchwald and Ed Williams and Kay Graham showed up and sat with us. And then my parents came, and they came and said that the surgery was successful. And so that day, Ben had to leave, and he had to go to the courthouse the night of the surgery, the afternoon of the surgery. And the verdict was guilty for the Washington Post. And Ben was devastated, as you can imagine, because the story was accurate. And so we went to the intensive care unit, and Quinn was there, and he was completely knocked out and, on all these tubes, just this tiny little thing just lying there. And the doctor said, you have got to go home and get some rest, because I hadn't slept in weeks, and neither had Ben. And so we went home, and Ben said, we both agreed, everybody was so devastated from the trial that we decided to get them to come over to the house that night for dinner. And so we ordered carry-out Chinese, and all the lawyers and Woodward and Pat Tyler and all the reporters came to our house. And we had a party. We had Chinese food. I was in a state, and I went upstairs to take a shower, and I fell on the floor in the shower. I was crying so hard I couldn't stop crying. And then Ben came in and got me out of the shower and put a towel around me and, said, it's going to be okay. I mean, he was just so strong throughout it all, because I just couldn't have made it without him. I couldn't have. And so we went down and we had a couple of glasses of wine and then we went to bed and slept, and then it was the best thing we could have done. And we got to the hospital the next morning, and Quinn was beginning to, get better. I was pumping milk and able to feed him. And his recovery was just miraculous. I mean, we took him home in about 5 or 6 days, and then we took him up to Long Island. But it was clear that there were going to be a lot of problems. And as it turned out, he had medical problems, just endless medical problems. He was sick in and out of the hospital constantly. He was getting pneumonia. He was getting bronchitis. He had to have ear surgery. He had to have his tonsils out. He had hearing problems. He had terrible speech problems. We had to have him speech. we had surgery on his throat 4 times, where they had to slit his throat open and create this flap because he couldn't speak properly. And it went on and on and on. And just Ben was there. I lived in the hospital most of the time. I had to take time off from the post, but Ben was there all the time. And just, he was so loving and so supportive to Quinn. I mean, but he bonded with Quinn in a way I just couldn't imagine. And you know, one of the things that Ben has never been good at is weakness. He sort of deplores weakness in other people. As I said, he doesn't like to hear whining or complaining. He can't stand people who are feeling sorry for themselves, who are acting like victims. And weakness has always been something that he's just been almost repulsed by. And so it was stunning to me that he would be drawn toward Quinn with all of his problems. And it was almost like this was his calling. If whatever he did in Watergate, whatever he did in World War II, whatever he did all of his life, that somehow this is what he was meant to do, is that he was meant to take care of the special needs child and give him the strength and the confidence that he needed to grow up and be a functioning person. Because, as I said, I don't think that would ever have happened. And so that's when he started really bonding with Quinn, and that brought Ben and me closer together. Although there were times when Ben just didn't want to face the problems that Quinn had. It was awfully hard for him. Quinn started a special school when he was 4. He went to the lab school, and I was devastated by that because, of course, that was not my plan for Quinn. My plan for Quinn was that he was going to go to St. Albans and Harvard, and he was going to be Ben, you know. And it became clear that that wasn't the plan at all. And so it took me a long time to try to accept that and accept the issues that Quinn had. And it's hard to explain, but Ben, I mean, the arguments we had were that Ben kept saying, he's going to be fine. And, but I knew that the medical reports showed that he wasn't going to be fine, you know? And so I would get really upset with Ben for I felt just sort of being unrealistic about what we were dealing with. And on some level, he may well have been, but it was actually the right thing, because it was his confidence and his belief in Quinn that kept me going and that created the person that Quinn became. And so when Quinn was 8, he was seeing this psychiatrist, or when Quinn was 8, he was seeing this therapist, and she did some tests on him, and one day we went in to see her, and she said, well, I have some bad news for you. He is completely retarded, and he will never finish high school, and he'll never have a job, and he'll never have a relationship. And in fact, he belongs in an institution. And I have called this institution out in Maryland, and I have made an appointment, a reservation for him, and reserved a place for him starting in January. This is in October, November. And I was in shock. I mean, literally, Ben had to carry me out to the car. And I couldn't even get in the car. I was crying so hard. It sounds like I'm crying all the time, but I was crying a lot over Quinn, I have to say. And Ben I just said, I can't believe this, I can't. And Ben just said, fuck her. She's wrong. And I knew in my gut she was wrong too, but, you know, I just couldn't grasp it. Anyway, we had him tested again. We went back to the lab school. They were outraged. It turns out she was wrong, totally wrong about everything. And, I mean, that has happened to us so many times with Quinn, where he has confounded everybody by just doing things that no one ever believed he could do and achieving things that no one could ever believe. And I think that I think with Ben working out in the woods with Quinn, he got him a little baby chainsaw. I was terrified, but he showed him how to use it safely. And they would get in their Jeep every day and they would drive off and they'd have a special project and they had a big burn pile. And Quinn would talk to Ben about his dad and how he would work out in the woods with his dad. And it was just so life-giving. And Quinn continued to have problems, continued to have these, but he had this confidence. Quinn did, always. We went to a drugstore one day and Quinn asked the druggist something. He wanted something on the counter and the druggist said, "I'm sorry, what is that?" And Quinn repeated himself. And the guy said, "No, I'm really sorry, but I just don't understand you." And so Quinn said it a third time and the guy said, "Oh, I'm really sorry, but I just didn't understand it." And Quinn turns to me and he says, "Mom, what's his problem?" And I thought, this is perfect, this is perfect. This is what Ben would have said, What was the guy's problem? It wasn't Quinn's problem. And we had, he was having surgery until he was 16. And, I had days where I couldn't even get out of bed. I was so depressed. And Ben never lost his faith or his confidence in Quinn. And when Quinn went off to boarding school, he went to a special school for boys with learning disabilities. The teacher told us that Quinn, the math teacher said, "Look, I'm sorry, but there's some kids who get it and some don't. Quinn just doesn't get it, and he's never going to be able to do math." And Ben just said, "That's bullshit." And he worked with Quinn on his math during his vacations. This is a boarding school. At the end of the year, Quinn got the math prize. And Quinn was scheduled to have some tests at Children's Hospital, some cognitive testing. And I had scheduled to be in a spa in California, and I decided I couldn't go because that's when they'd schedule the tests. And Ben said, no, I'll take him. It'll just be fine. They're not going to do anything except test him. So anyway, I went off to the spa, and I walked the labyrinth, which is this incredible sort of like a maze, and it's a meditation tool. And I remember sitting in the labyrinth the first day I walked it, and it was in this grove of trees, live oak trees. And I looked up, and in front of me, while I was meditating, there was this huge fir tree, just evergreen, this gorgeous evergreen tree. And I looked at it and I thought, you know what? That tree is Quinn. It's different from all the other trees, but it's the most beautiful tree here. And that's what Ben had always said about Quinn, is that he's different, but he's beautiful. He's more beautiful than all the other trees. And so the following year, so that I had done that the first year, the following year I went out and I walked the labyrinth, and I chose the time that Quinn was going to be taking the test. And Ben said, "Don't worry, I'm going to take him. I'm going to be with him the whole time." And so I walked the labyrinth and I meditated on that tree while he was taking the tests. And so a few weeks later, they called us in, and we went in, and they said, "Well, there's good news and there's bad news." The bad news is that he's tested very badly. I mean, really low on all of these in every area. But there's one test that he scored higher than anybody we have ever tested ever, and that is the maze. And of course, that's what I'd been walking, is the maze. But Ben had been there with him the whole time. And as it turned out, Quinn's a magical person, and Ben is a magical person. And I've not known very many people who, what I call, have the magic. And Quinn got his magic from Ben. I mean, if you really want to know about Ben, I mean, people used to say, "What's the one word you would use to describe Ben?" I would say swashbuckling. But I think really now the word I would use is magical, because, there's something about Ben that you just can't describe. When he just walked into a room, he created magic wherever he went. And Quinn has that quality too. I mean, for Ben, who was so patient with Quinn and so understanding and so loving and so affectionate, and it was the first time in his life he's ever had a relationship like that. I mean, it was certainly different from my relationship with him, but I think that he learned a lot from Ben. And I think that Ben really liked himself so much better after Quinn was born. He became the person that he really was and the person he was meant to be, and not the tough guy that was going to run over his grandmother to get a story, you know. We had a wonderful marriage. I was madly in love with Quinn. No, sorry. I was in love with Quinn. I was madly in love with Ben from the first moment we got together. And I was madly in love with him until the moment he died. And he was madly in love with me, always. And we never considered ever splitting up. We never had any problems like that. We obviously had areas of discussion, things we disagreed on, but we both loved all the same things. We both had the same values. We both were just passionate about journalism and newspapering, and we liked the same people, and we both loved to have fun, which was really important. You have to have a balance in your life, and you have to have fun. But I mean, we were lucky. We were just really lucky that we found each other, because we were perfect for each other. We were perfect together. And I just feel so grateful that I had this incredible life with this extraordinary man. And I never doubted for a moment that he loved me. He never doubted for a moment that I loved him. Never talked about it for a second. He didn't care. He was doing the best he could and living the best life he could, and somebody, the Ben Bradlee Prize this and a Ben Bradlee Prize that, and they've just started a new Ben Bradlee Prize at the Washington Post. And I've not started any kind of a Ben Bradlee thing or a prize or an event or an award or because I don't want to be the keeper of the flame. That's not what he would have wanted. Ben doesn't need a keeper of the flame. I mean, Ben was his own flame, and he certainly didn't need me for that. And, his flame will never die, that's for sure. During the campaign, people were often asking me how Ben would have felt and what he would have done and everything, and I said Ben would have been conflicted about it. I think he would have thought, on the one hand, this is a great story, and on the other hand, I think he would have been really concerned for the country. And maybe the latter would have outweighed the former. I think now, the day after the election, I woke up and I felt so alone. I don't think I've ever felt that alone in my life. And I, looked over to the other side of the bed and it was empty, and I just thought, I don't think I can do this. And all I could think about was Ben and what he would have done, and I know what he would have done. He would have jumped out of bed and he would have said, let's go get those stories, And for him, if he thought that there was any threat to the First Amendment, any threat to freedom of speech, any threat to our country, he would have been on it until the day he died. I put that together. I don't even know how I did it when I think about it, because there were 3,000 people there, and it was this 2-hour-long ceremony, and I look back on it and think, who did that? Because I was in such a state of grief that I was kind of going through the motions. I mean, he was in hospice for some weeks before he died, so I actually had started making some plans. I'd gone to the cathedral and talked to them. But I think that I wanted people to feel, and I think that this was the overwhelming feeling in the cathedral. I mean, everybody was crying. I mean, that wasn't my intention one way or the other, but I wanted people to have a feeling of transcendence. I wanted people to feel as though at that moment they were transcending their own life, and that somehow Ben was able in his own life to transcend all of the sorrow, whatever pain he had, whatever evil there was, whatever darkness there was in the world, that Ben had this incredible spirit that just transcended all of that. I mean, he was a very spiritual person. He wasn't actively religious. But somehow I just wanted everyone to feel uplifted. And I think that they did. I think in the end, though people were crying, they weren't, I mean, it was sad, but it was uplifting in a way. I think everybody just felt, it was almost a sort of a sense of levitation in that cathedral that day. The music was beautiful, and the emotions were real. There was it seemed to me, so much authenticity there, and so much beauty there, and there was a sense of the divine. I just felt that overwhelmed with love and certainly grief, but love. But I felt for that moment, I looked at Ben's casket and I knew he would love this funeral more than anything. And so I felt a certain sense of joy that I could do this for him and honor him in this way. But I guess in the end, I think it was transcendence that I think people felt.